Hello, everyone. I'm Keith the Stone with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm here as often with Greg Naj, Janet, and Sarah and Elen for HeroesX office hours. This is v16 of HeroesX, and we're talking about hours 20 and 21, the Hippolytus and the Bacchae of Euripides. Greg, your question for the participants for hour 20 is as follows. Just as Hippolytus is a cult hero, in what ways can you say, based on the readings, that Phaedra is a cult hero in her own right? What are folks saying about this one?
Well, one participant is commenting and he's saying Phaedra, by being present and prominent in this tragedy, has been immortalized, and she is visualized by the thousands in the state theater. She has been influenced by both Artemis and Aphrodite. The chorus has lamented her troubles in life and her death, but have there been prayers and sacrifices offered to her? What else would show her to be a cult hero? Was there a sacred space for her worship?
And could I say that, in a way, when I wrote that question, I had reread Pausanias, that wonderful traveler in the 2nd century CE, who filters out most of the effects of the Roman Empire, and you think you're back in some timeless classical space. And when our traveler Pausanias, and let me repeat, this is somebody who lived in the 2nd century of our era, which is to say over half a millennium after Euripides. Our traveler, when he visits Troezen, actually indicates explicitly that there was a sacred space for Phaedra, not just for Hippolytus. So that in a way, you could say that Phaedra and Hippolytus are in a condominium with Aphrodite. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, if the goddess Artemis is listening, please don't punish me. In a condominium with Artemis and Aphrodite both.
One participant mentioned Artemis and Aphrodite, and these two gods as god antagonists seem two different areas of a woman's life. So are these gods causing inner turmoil in Phaedra? And this inner turmoil is her agōn. Can we think like that?
That is a breakthrough insight. That is marvelous. I wish I had ever thought that. But I agree with this thought. So in a sense, we're all thinking it now. I love that because you see, from my point of view, and you know, dear Janet, how I reconstruct. I started doing that by way of only linguistics, but eventually I got interested in reconstructing institutions, thought patterns, the works, although it's still primarily via linguistics, but now it's also via the reportage of some very accurate reporters like Pausanias, no matter how late he is relative to the classical period. And look, in terms of my reconstructions, Aphrodite and Artemis can be reconstructed as one goddess with two different aspects. So in a sense, the agōn of Phaedra, as this participant so beautifully formulated it, that agōn almost recapitulates the evolution of Artemis / Aphrodite in terms of earlier visualizations where you could see them both as one persona, just as, for example, with goddesses of an earlier era. And we don't see this with Athena, we don't see this with Artemis, we don't see this with Aphrodite, but with goddesses in an earlier era, they could be simultaneously or within a year cycle, virgin and mother. mother and virgin, a constant recycling. And in the classical period, that's still, and post-classical period, it's still attested for Hera, but certainly not for Athena. I mean, it's just unthinkable to think of Athena as once having been a mother, or Artemis, both of them. And so when it comes to how I imagine goddesses in the second millennium before our era, as opposed to the first millennium before our era, which edges into the classical and post-classical periods, I must say that this particular drama, the Hippolytus, explores the agōn within the self of how to deal with two very different aspects of one's life and two different aspects of either one goddess who has one name or two goddesses with names that fit the two different functions or aspects. Well, thank you, participant. Thank you, Janet, for channeling our participants so beautifully.
Someone else has been making a comparison with Oedipus.
Yes.
Both Phaedra and Oedipus have these character flaws, and ultimately, of course, they both have to die. So they then have that potential for cult status in death.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Oh yes. And
yet, but it seems to have a very different feel from the epic heroes who, we all see them all kind of fighting and struggling. And a lot of times we don't even see their deaths.
Well, dear Sarah, what you just said is a perfect introduction to the Bacchae or the Bacchae of Euripides, because I can't get over, dear Sarah, how when Dionysus is, shall we say, addressing Pentheus and predicting what his ordeal will be, he actually says that you, Pentheus, will get a kleos. And I say to myself, what a perfect coming full circle from the kleos that an epic hero like Achilles is destined to have. A tragic hero like Pentheus is destined to have kleos. And even in the words of Dionysus, that destiny is expressed in terms that really make us understand that there is a lot to compare, more to compare than meets the eye.
Well, that's exactly our question for the Bacchae. Should we go to that one and answer them all together here? That question is, in the Bacchae of Euripides, how is the kleos of Pentheus similar to the kleos of Achilles in the Iliad?
And let's see what our participants have to say on this one.
Yeah, this is not an easy question.
No.
And no, it's a difficult one. So one participant says both heroes are antagonists of the gods. Both suffered death. They were fated for, in no small part, due to the antagonist. Both, after ultimately death, gain kleos. Both gain immortalization from the recitals of poetry and prose.
Nice. Well, here's something, and let me conjure one of the greatest thinkers of our not so distant past, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche, who perceived a dyadism between Apollo and Dionysus. The divine antagonist of Achilles is Apollo. The divine antagonist of Dionysus, let's try that again. The divine antagonist of Pentheus is Dionysus. So in a sense, the dyadism of Achilles and Pentheus matches the dyadism that Nietzsche saw clearly, I think, between Apollo and Dionysus. I hope I had the proportion straight. And then it turns out something that Nietzsche, I don't believe, writes about anywhere. It turns out that if you look very closely at the way Apollo and Dionysus were worshipped in the past, at a place like Delphi, they are dyadically worshipped. By dyadically, I mean that for one phase of the year, it's Dionysus, and for another phase, it's Apollo. And when Apollo is worshipped, Dionysus is in a tomb. Ooh, what is he doing in a tomb? This brings us to something else that's very, very, very difficult. And I've been trying to avoid it in our meetings because it's pre-Olympian. But looking at the gods from the standpoint of earlier eras, earlier than the classical and immediately pre-classical era, going way back to the second millennium before our era, when gods could die seasonally, just as we mortals die. Oops, do we come back to life? Well, that's another problem. But the model of the dying god is so apparent, even in the so-called Hellenistic era, the era that comes after Alexander the Great, where it's just very clear that on the island of Crete, not just somebody like Dionysus, but Zeus himself dies every year. And that was known in the classical era about strange Cretan, I almost said belief systems, but I try not to say belief, mythological systems that are tied to ritual. I'm sorry, dear Janet, you were going to say.
Yes. Dionysus has not been recognized when he came to Thebes, and people didn't recognize him, and Pentheus didn't recognize him. Can we make a parallel to Achilles not being honored and recognized by Agamemnon or by his comrades as a leader? Maybe it's a stretch, but I'm trying to make a connection.
No, it's not a stretch. I love it. And you know what, Janet? What you just said is even more parallel than I thought before. I like the way you said it, because look, Achilles is alienated from his people, his own people, at the dramatic moment of the Iliad as it plays out. But in real life, Achilles is embraced by his people. He is the point of definition for what it is to be an Achaean. And even the fact that there are references to Achaeans wearing long hair is a signal that Achilles and the Achaeans are paired through time, but not at the dramatic moment of the Iliad. We can easily forget that if we simply go on our first impression, since we don't have the background of ancient Greek song culture and ancient Greek myths and rituals. But the alienation of Achilles from his people in the Iliad sometimes is negated even in the Iliad. Even in the Iliad, it's clear that in the future, or at least it's clear to me that in the future there will be a symbiotic relationship, and that Achaeans, once they stop being Achaeans and become Greeks, like those who receive the Iliad, they're going to be wearing short hair like Achilles too, just as Achilles cuts his hair already in the Iliad. Most Greek males in most Greek communities cut their hair. That's the norm. Of course, the Spartans have to be different, but they're always different. So they have long hair, but look, everybody else wears short hair.
Someone else is looking at a similarity between Achilles and Pentheus in that they both have very fixed views. They don't seem to want to change their minds. They're not willing to contemplate the consequence. But then there is a difference in that Achilles does change at the end of the Iliad. We see him then restoring Hector's body to Priam, whereas Pentheus just doesn't change and reaps the consequences.
No, he does not. But here's something, dear Sarah, is let's think of the fact that Achilles is not the only actant of the role of Achilles, because he has his body double, his alter ego, Patroklos, do many things for him that he should be doing. I say should be in the fullness of time. And I'm thinking of that moment where Patroklos rushes at Apollo, and three times he rushes at Apollo, and Apollo says, back off. And so eventually the fourth time he backs off, but that's the dress rehearsal. And then when he does it again, he doesn't back off and he gets killed. So may I put it this way, the stubbornness syndrome that our participant and you have noticed is there in the form of Patroklos's fatal attraction to Apollo. He just has to attack Apollo. And that is, shall we say, quite parallel to the way Pentheus just has to attack Dionysus.
Wow, I love that. I often forget about Patroklos as a stand-in for Achilles, even though it's so basic to your analysis, Greg. It's still bears fruit, unexpected places.
It's a chilling moment, and I think we talked about this in one of our earlier meetings. A professor who used to teach me, the late Cedric Whitman, used to say that the most terrifying moment in all Greek literature is when a god with his own hand kills a human. And that's very rare. And that's what happens when Apollo, with a downturned hand, smites Patroklos. Okay, it turns out he needs a three-way death, but without Apollo, the death wouldn't have happened.
Well, thanks for this conversation again, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. And we'll be back next week to talk about Socrates, or Plato's Socrates, more accurately said. So until then.